So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Andrew Luttrell today to speak with us today. Andy is an assistant professor of psychological science at Ball State University. His research centers on people's opinions, including when and how those attitudes change. In particular, he's interested in what happens when people moralize their attitudes and how moral persuasive rhetoric can sometimes be compelling and sometimes backfire, which is, I think, what we're going to hear today as well. He also studies the feeling of ambivalence and the stability of people's opinions over time. His research has looked at many different opinions, including attitudes towards social, environmental, political, and consumer issues. He's published in leading academic journals such as Psychological Science, British Journal of Social Psychology, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, and Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, and many more. So we're very excited to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming him as he presents Moralized Attitudes, Strong or Susceptible to Change.
Great, thank you. And Melton, but can I ask a Q&A? What's the protocol there?
So we typically have Q&A after your talk. People will write in either in the chat or the Q&A, and then we can read it out loud to you, or you could read it yourself.
Perfect.
And answer it at the end of the session.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I'll try to be mindful of time and make sure that there is that time at the end, because I'm very curious to get feedback on this. So we will see. We will see if there are slides that end up getting glossed over, but we'll cross those paths as we come to it. So yeah, so I'm very excited to be presenting this work on moralized attitudes. My goal in putting this together was to kind of present an expansive set of the kind of work that I'm doing in this space, just to kind of introduce people to the perspective that I'm bringing to moralization and persuasion, which is going to include some stuff that's already out and also some stuff that is still in the works, and feedback on that stuff is always appreciated. So we got a lot to do, so we're going to jump right in. And just to sort of center the ideas that we're talking about, the conversation about vaccination and how we best communicate to others the reasons for getting COVID vaccinations and considering getting COVID vaccinations and encouraging friends and family is ever present, right? Even though the rollout started what seems like so long ago, this is still the conversation we're having. And I was really struck in my state of Ohio in the US when our governor put out this message regarding a opening up of vaccine eligibility to a very broad audience. Where he very specifically calls it a moral imperative that we move as quickly as we can to vaccinate all Ohioans, right? So here's a case where the notion of vaccination is being couched very deliberately in morality, which can either communicate Governor DeWine and his staff's feelings about this policy or about this behavior, but may also serve as a rhetorical strategy as well. And moralizing in this domain is obviously nothing that is restricted to just Ohio. We can see people using moral rhetoric, moral language, talking about these issues in a moral light across the divide in terms of people's opinions as it comes to this, right? So people moralizing the benefits of vaccination, the need for vaccination, and those moralizing the concerns about vaccine mandates, right? So it's also not just about vaccination. I once dabbled in using Google Alerts to sort of see like what's out there in terms of what I'm interested in studying. And so I set up a Google Alert for, quote, a moral issue, just to see what came up. And very quickly, I had to stop this Google Alert because my inbox was just inundated constantly with things getting moralized, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of things getting moralized. You can see here just from headlines, the use of this moral language very clearly taking issues as diverse as climate change and voting and drug policy and attaching it to a sense of moral significance. And so this is evocative of a dilemma in some cases when we think about morality in the domain of attitudes and persuasion, because sometimes issues themselves feel as though they are inherently moral issues, right? There are moral issues and there are non-moral issues, right? So some people may say, well, same-sex marriage, that's the kind of issue that's a moral issue. Factory farming, abortion, environmentalism, these are moral issues. And historically, if you look at sort of the earlier public policy analyses, there is this tendency to talk about issues as like there are the moral ones and then there are the ones that are not about morality. But we've started to see actually that this can be a little limiting. And in fact, it may be more advantageous to think of moralization not as a property of an issue, but a property of a person's perception of the issue or property of the person's attitude toward the issue. So for any one of these, people may vary in how much they see this as a moral issue and how much they base their own issue opinions on their moral beliefs and convictions. And just as one example of this was a Pew poll from 2013 in the United States. I think this one was US specific, but they've done similar kinds of polling globally, where they ask about all sorts of issues. And in this case, I think it's really striking where we get these really high quality Pew data, people rendering their position on a variety of issues that we might be inclined to call just inherently moral. But you're seeing a substantial proportion of people opt out of calling it a moral issue, right? It's neither morally wrong or acceptable, but I don't classify this in the moral domain. In the empirical record, we have similar kinds of findings like this. So Wright et al. In 2008 looked at 40 different issues that ranged across all sorts of topic areas and domains, and they asked people to classify them as moral or non-moral issues, right? And so in some case, one way to look at this is to say that all of these issues were moralized to some degree. And there's even evidence to show that issues that you might go like, I never would have expected morality to be relevant, people still bring a sense of morality to them. But I think what's also striking about their findings is this quote from their discussion, which is that of the 40 issues that participants considered, none of them were unanimously classified as moral, right? So again, we're sort of inclined to think about the morality of an issue not as a property of the issue, but as something idiosyncratic to the way that a person is approaching that issue, right? So if I'm going to define attitude moralization, this is how I would put it. So it's a metacognition in terms of how much someone perceives a moral basis for an attitude. I'm going to emphasize that perception part because we have some evidence to show that just the mere perception that this thing is morally relevant can be sufficient to produce these kinds of outcomes. We don't necessarily have to know that, like, in the inner workings of a person's brain, their moral values got tied up in these issues, but it's the way that people are approaching their attitude through this metacognitive perception. So what this means is that we can take an issue and classify it, again, not as an issue that's moral, but ask people what their attitude toward it is, right? So let's say we have an interest in fair trade in consumer psychology, and we have two people who both say that they're in favor of fair trade. On a consumer survey, they rate it identically, right? And so it would look like these two people are exactly the same in terms of their approach or their thinking on fair trade certified foods and products. But one person may say that I support fair trade products because those products are the product of better craftsmanship, more time goes into them, so we get a better quality product at the end. Whereas another person might say that my pro-fair trade attitude really stems from my moral concern for others and making sure we're treating people fairly, right? So here's a case where this is a classic attitude strength kind of setup, which is that two people might look identical on an attitude survey, but it is misleading because they really are coming to the question from different perspectives. And so the question is, does it matter? Does it matter that some people moralize their attitudes and others don't, or that some attitudes are moralized and others aren't? And so we can tie this to attitude strength and bring it into the domain of attitude strength, which is to ask questions about the attitude's durability and influence. So strong attitudes, by definition, are attitudes that influence our choices and thinking, and attitudes that resist being changed when challenged or when left to, just the ebbs of time. And so do we have evidence of this? I'm going to show you, by the way, a very biased selection of the research, which is to say stuff that came out of my lab, but I'm by no means the only one who's been doing this kind of work. So in terms of predicting behavior, we had a paper this year showing in the consumer domain that when people moralize an attitude toward a product category like fair trade, it's a strong predictor of both their intentions to make purchases from that product domain and their reports of actually making purchases in that domain as well. There's plenty of work in political psychology that shows similar kinds of things, that when people moralize their political attitudes, those attitudes become stronger predictors of who they vote for, whether they vote, how far they sit from people who they disagree with, et cetera. So behavior, this I think is the piece of the puzzle that's the best supported so far. But I'm really interested in when attitudes change and for whom do they change. Another paper from this year, we find across, I think, 19 different topics, some consistent evidence. It varies a little bit by topic, but the big pattern is there, which is that the more people moralize their attitudes towards some topic at time one, the more their attitude reports at time 2 were consistent, right? Suggesting that there was greater stability over time. Some of these have delays up to a year, showing that those attitudes are more stable over time to the extent that the person moralizes that attitude. And then most relevant to the rest of what I'm going to talk about is people's responses to persuasive communication. So we found that perceiving a moral basis for attitudes led to resistance to a persuasive message. So here this is what I was talking about before, randomly assign people to think about an attitude in terms of its moral relevance or not. And when we encouraged people to connect their attitude to a feeling of moral right and wrong, when we presented them with new information, they were less likely to change their mind, even though that very information was relatively compelling to people who hadn't connected their initial opinion to a sense of morality. So this is the part that I want to focus on today, which is, sure, we have documented that moralization can accompany a resistance to changing one's mind in the face of new information, but is that necessarily the case? Is there something inherent to moralization that makes attitudes rigid? Or is moralization giving us information that suggests resistance under some circumstances, but not under all circumstances? And that's where we're headed here. And so to sort of piece out what the possibilities are, we can look at what are the kinds of ways in which moralized attitudes have been resistant in the past, right? And sometimes the bulk of this research is showing that people resist conformity pressures, right? So if I moralize my attitude, I don't care what the 10 people in line in front of me said their position was, I'm not affected. I'm still going to render my position the way that I ordinarily would have, even if I didn't know that there was social pressure against my view. And as I mentioned, we show resistance to persuasive arguments, but importantly, the arguments that we used in those studies were relatively pragmatic in nature, right? So people were moralizing their view on recycling, but we were trying to change that view by saying it's kind of really expensive and it's inefficient and it has these additional costs and burdens. And so if we look at these, it's possible that morality is not making people resistant to any information. It's just that the kinds of pressures that the past research has put on people's opinions has just been irrelevant to the core concerns of attitude moralizers, right? Which is to say, okay, I don't care that people have different opinions as me. That's not my concern. I don't care that this thing is really expensive. I think it's the right thing to do, which raises the question, what would happen if we deliberately confronted people with information that was directly about the morality of the issue? Right. So maybe moralization was predicting resistance just because all of these interventions were missing the point that this audience cares about. So if we go right to the heart of the core concern, and moralization is just showing, hey, I'm not going to keep this idea forever. I just am going to keep it as long as the moral information is on my side. Right. So maybe if we pinch people this way, we'll see susceptibility to change. Oh, I do this in my classes too. I build in transitions just to keep me on my toes. I always forget where they are. So cue a dramatic transition here. Is this kind of moral rhetoric common in the world? So back to my exploits in Google alerts that lasted about 2.5 days. Set one up for a moral case for, and you similarly are inundated with all sorts of examples of people trying to communicate some point by very specifically framing their strategy in terms of talking about the immorality or morality of some issue, right? Again, and across all sorts of different domains, we see this kind of approach is pretty common. And when you look at analyses of debates in Congress or public policy debates or op-eds, moral rhetoric shows up all over the place. There's some evidence that moral persuasion is especially effective, but then there's also evidence that shows that it's not any more effective or maybe backfires, right? Which raises the question, okay, probably moral persuasion is not absolutely effective or not, but it'll be more effective for some audiences than others. And maybe this moralization piece of the puzzle helps us understand that. So we devised 2 competing hypotheses when we thought about what would happen if we confronted people with moral rhetoric about an issue that they moralize or not. One is a moral strength perspective, which is, I think, most consistent with the way moralized attitudes have been treated in the literature thus far, which is that moralization is just related to resistance, right? It doesn't matter what information you confront people with, they've taken a stand that they're unwilling to budge from. But there's all sorts of work in persuasion on what's called matching effects, which is that message appeals are more persuasive when they speak directly to a concern that the recipient of the message has, right? So for example, emotional messages might be most effective for people who already hold a more affect-based attitude, right? And so in this case, a moral appeal may actually be exactly the thing that would open someone up to changing their mind if they initially moralized their view, right? Because it's speaking directly to the domain of interest for that recipient, right? And so totally, honestly, I had no idea where things were going to go when we ran these studies, and yet we found the same results over and over again. And maybe you know where this is going. So the first way that we approached this was to go back to that recycling paradigm, which is really just useful because almost everybody comes into surveys pro recycling, and so we know that if we present anti-recycling messages, it's going to challenge almost everyone's view, right? We wanted to really set this up as like a challenge, like let's work against ourselves and really see if people are willing to budge in the face of counter-attitudinal information. Just to note, what I'm going to show you are two studies that are direct replications combined. The findings are not moderated by study, but you can see the paper for those separated by sample. So people start, they report their attitudes toward recycling. Then we give them an anti-recycling message that we pre-tested as appealing to morality versus practicality. So saying recycling is costly and unfeasible, it's expensive and inefficient, prohibitively expensive, or it's harmful and immoral, using language that evokes moral concern. And we pre-tested these so that they were perceived as similarly strong to a sample of respondents. But nevertheless, were different in their appeal to morality. So then we have people list their thoughts in response to that essay, which we code for whether they're favorable to the essay's point, unfavorable to the essay's point, or neutral. And then we just ask people's attitudes toward recycling again. And what we find is this significant interaction that is consistent with the moral matching hypothesis, right? And so if we start, we can look at that dotted line first, which is people's responses to a practical message. And here is exactly the pattern you would have expected from the existing research on moralized attitudes, right? The more people perceive a moral basis for their attitude, the less they change their attitude in response to new information, right? So this would be a classic resistance effect. More moralization is less attitude change, but that's when we appeal to something that might be irrelevant to folks with moralized attitudes. And so by contrast, when we look at the moral arguments, this is a non-significant reversal, but we see the scales tip in the other direction. But the strongest case that we can make here is that we've undermined the resistance that moralization normally confers. And if we look here at the high end of those who most moralize their attitudes, it's the moral message that is most persuasive, and that's more persuasive than the practical message, right? So this is a matching effect, suggesting that it's not just that moralization is related to resistance across the board, but it's related to resistance when messages fail to directly confront the basis of the issue that those participants most care about. That is mediated by the thoughts that they wrote in response to the message, which shows this is probably something that's reasonably thoughtful as a process. And I'm just for the sake of time, I'm going to very quickly note, we extended this beyond recycling because some people were like, it's kind of weird though, right, to argue against recycling, and maybe that's what's going on. And so we thought, okay, like let's find an issue that feels normal that someone would present either side of that issue. And so as it turns out, we discovered that MTurk participants at the time were overwhelmingly in favor of legalizing marijuana. And so we thought, okay, so we can find something that is practically useful here. So we constructed messages that argue against legalizing marijuana on the basis of moral or practical grounds, right? Which doesn't seem that weird to participants, right? So we say it's unwise and impractical to do this, or it's harmful and immoral, has ethical consequences. And we find weaker because people are just on average more resistant to persuasion on this issue, which is sensible, but the pattern is there, and meta-analytically across all the studies we have here, this interaction is reliable. So again, practical messages are associated with a moral resistance effect, but moral messages don't evoke that same resistance pattern. And again, those who most moralize their initial attitude are the ones who are more persuaded by the moral message than by the practical message. Okay, and mediated by thoughts. So interim summary here is that the evidence we have for the moral matching hypothesis seems to convey that moralization is, in fact, related to resistance to practical arguments. When people perceive a moral basis to their attitude, they are more resistant to persuasion in the face of pragmatic arguments. But that's not the case when the message argues for morality, right? And we find that, well, I'll make this more macro point later. Interactions are tricky because they can take on different forms, even though they communicate similar points. And we're going to kind of see that happen as we move into a domain where we're not going to try to confront people's attitudes so much, but we're going to try to open them up to relatively novel topics or ideas, right? So we'll see this interaction kind of shift, but tell a similar story. Okay, so far, this has been an exploration in just trying to understand, like, what would happen if we confront people with moral rhetoric and they've already moralized their attitudes? Like, we're really challenging people's views, what happens? And so, like I said, we have some good evidence for the moral matching pattern. And so since then, I've been extending this out to other domains to see whether the same premise of moral matching can apply in novel ways. So one way we can do this is to look at different kinds of messages and whether they operate as moral messages, right? In the last study, it was very deliberate. Like, it was so clear that, like, this is the moral appeal, this is the non-moral appeal. But are there some pre-existing, like, message typologies that naturally are interpreted as moral appeals, or not, even when that language isn't used? And this came about in March 2020, when what was I doing but watching a bunch of TV and public service announcements, and realizing that there were these two very different appeals to sort of going, hey, stay at home, don't go by other people. One of those approaches was, you don't want to get this virus, right? This nasty virus, stay away from other people, protect yourself, make sure you stay safe. And then a very different appeal for exactly the same behavior was, by doing these things, staying at home and keeping away from other people, you can protect the other people in your community, right? You can prevent yourself from spreading this virus beyond yourself. And it occurred to me that feels like a fairly moral appeal to practicing this behavior, right? This sort of, don't do it for you, do it for other people. And when we ran some pilot studies, we found that indeed people were interpreting that kind of message as a moral appeal. So for example, we sort of translate that in this way. Other people have the virus, even if they don't currently show symptoms. By practicing social distancing, you can help prevent yourself from contracting this virus. Think about your own health versus you can help prevent spreading this, and think about everyone's health, right? And over again, in all the studies that we have, when people, and I forgot to fix this. I knew that this typo was in here. Self-focused arguments for social distancing seemed less moral than other focused arguments, right? So routinely people interpret that other focus, what I'm calling other focused messages, as more of a moral appeal to practice social distancing. So if that's the case, does it persuade according to the patterns that are suggested by moral matching as sort of a general approach to messaging? So what we did is, rather than necessarily attack people's pre-existing views, we just measured their general sense of whether they are approaching public health as a domain from a moral perspective, right? Do they tend to think about public health issues as morally relevant? And that would capture what kind of recipient they would be of either of these kinds of messages. So here's what we find. This is collapsed across 3 studies, and we show similar effects on just a general question about how persuasive is this message to you, and also the same kind of effects on intentions to practice social distancing. So these were conducted, I think, in March, April, and June 2020. So here again, like I said, moralization is, to what extent do you think that public health is a moral issue, rather than like some pre-existing opinion that you have? And we find this interaction where, by and large, the other focused appeals were interpreted as more persuasive, which is consistent with some other work out there. But really, the real story here is this interaction pattern where those who most moralize public health are the ones that are showing this preference for the other focused message. Whereas people who aren't approaching public health from a moral vantage point are seeing little difference between the self-focused and other-focused appeal for practicing social distancing, right? So classic case of there had been this question of which is better, pro-social or selfish appeals. And here our interpretation is, well, one isn't just inherently better. It depends on who the person is who's receiving that message. And that pattern follows a moral matching pattern. Okay, scooting right along. Like I said, same pattern for intentions to actually practice social distancing. So another challenge then is to think, what if we don't know, right? Put on your applied hat and go, what if I don't know already whether someone moralizes some issue, right? Or maybe it's a brand new issue that no one's had a chance to really form an attitude about, right? Or a new domain that people haven't thought about. How could I decide still whether it would be advantageous to use moral rhetoric or non-moral rhetoric when I don't know the specifics of my issue? And so we thought, well, could some people just be kind of moralizers in general, right? They approach all sorts of issues from a moral vantage point, and they tend to build attitudes that are based on their moral beliefs and convictions. And so we set out to test whether there is any kind of intrapersonal variance in terms of dispositional moralizing, or person by person variance in dispositional moralizing, and then whether that matters for messaging. So in one study, and we've done this a handful of times, and the actual numbers that come out the other end are like almost always the same, which is striking when the actual proportions of variance are the same across studies. But we ask questions about all sorts of issues. And for each one, we ask, to what extent is your opinion regarding this topic based on your core moral beliefs and convictions? And shout out, by the way, to Linda Skitka and the work that she's done. We borrow very heavily from the measurement approach that her program of research has really well documented. And so this is plucked right from that tradition. So we ask, to what extent is your attitude toward this topic based on your core moral beliefs and convictions? And then since we have all sorts of people rating all sorts of topics, we can use a mixed effects model to parse out how much of the variance in the answers to this question are driven by the topics that are being evaluated, and how much of the variance is being driven by the fact that it's the same person giving answers to all 20 of these topics, right? And that might give us some sense of whether this is a disposition, that there's some sort of person level quality happening here. So we can look at the intraclass correlation coefficients, and we find substantial and significant variance accounted for by individuals, right? So 23% of the variance in moralization across all of these responses is accounted for by the individual differences dimension of the data. There's also significant variance that's accounted for by the topics themselves, right? I'm not claiming that some topics don't lend themselves more to moralizing than others, but it is striking, I think, that there's some sort of substantial proportion of variance driven by individuals. And so if this is the case, if we kind of flip this into an individual differences measure and just average moralizing across all sorts of topics, could it help us predict responses to persuasion on a topic that we didn't ask about, right? So that's sort of where we're going here. So in this case, we followed that up. We did the same procedure. We found the same intraclass correlation coefficient results. And then we present people with either a moral or an economic appeal in favor of a reparations program. So in the US, this is redistributing wealth to marginalized groups, Black Americans typically, as a way to account for historical inequities. So this is a topic that at least our students are relatively less familiar with and probably haven't already formed a sense of where they stand on it. And we never asked any questions about whether they moralize this issue, right? We ask about all sorts of other issues, but not this one, right? And so here's what those messages look like, right? Again, very similarly, these are equated on strength. One is just talking about the morality, the other about non-moral concerns. And we find a similar kind of interaction, right? And here's where I'm just going to point out that we actually get the, now moving forward, a lot of times we're getting the interactions driven by the moral message, whereas before we were kind of undermining a negative slope. And again, I think most of this is because we were looking at cases where people were entering like an adversarial relationship with us, where we were trying to challenge their views. And here we're introducing them to potentially novel ideas framed in ways that might resonate better with some audience members than others. And so here we show that when it's an economic message, dispositional moralizing was unrelated to how they viewed this message, which makes sense because that shouldn't be related to their response to that kind of message. But it is driving responses to a moral appeal, right? So again, such that the people who moralize stuff the most are more compelled by the moral message than the economic message. And just as a heads up for where this is going, there's an established individual differences measure called moral attentiveness, which produces the same interaction here. So it seems like it's capturing what we're talking about. And it's really about, it has questions like, to what extent do you tend to think about ethics? Do you like to think about the ethical considerations of stuff, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And so that disposition does seem to track a general sense of moralizing. And I bring it up because it's what we use in the next study. So to push this further, right, we've been looking at like how persuasive do you think this message is, but haven't really probed how persuasive is it? Is it changing people's attitudes? Is it getting people to be interested in the topic? And so here we shift to an MTurk study. We're using moral attentiveness as our index of dispositional moralizing. And here we have a moral case for veganism or a health case for veganism, right? Pre-tested to show that the moral one seems more moral, right? Is it driven by concerns about animal welfare, or is it driven by concerns about your own health, right? And so here we get the same effect, but this time we're actually looking not at how persuasive do you think this message is, but right now, how do you evaluate veganism, right? Do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea? Are you in favor or against it? And we're getting the same interaction on this sort of index of true persuasion, quote unquote, where again, when it's a health message, tendencies to moralize issues are untied to the compellingness of a health message, but they're positively tied to the persuasiveness of a moral message, where again, here, the most moralizing folks are the ones who are more persuaded by the moral message than the health message. Okay, so that's dispositional moralizing. Third and final extension of moral matching brings this into the sort of addresses a question that always comes up when I present this, which is like, okay, so all I have to do is just like make any moral pitch and it's going to resonate with people who see the issue in terms of morality. And, probably not, right? Like this, there's not kind of one way to present the moral case for something, as this research by Feinberg and Willer have shown very nicely over and over again, that persuasion tends to be enhanced when the message uses moral rhetoric that is specifically tailored to the moral values of liberal versus conservative ideology, right? So some moral appeals are going to resonate more with liberals. Some moral appeals are going to resonate more with right-wing conservative folks. But is that further dependent on whether people are actually moralizing the issue to begin with, right? Or moralizing their ideology to begin with? And so that's sort of where we're headed to see, will it matter what kind of appeal we make? And just to be clear, the messages we've been using in the studies up until this point, I've been very careful to incorporate all sorts of moral foundations from moral foundations theory to make sure that it's not just appealing to one sense of morality. So we've been kind of expansive up until this point, but what if we do get more nuanced and be more deliberate about the kind of moral appeal that we make? So this is a study from 900 prolific participants, deliberately recruited so that half identified as Democrat, half as Republican. This is in the US. We measure political ideology, and a little different here, this is sort of plucked from a different project that I'm not going to give the whole background for, but we measure how much do you moralize your ideology, right? How much are your political views grounded in a sense of moral beliefs and convictions? And then we present mask appeals, appeals for wearing face masks as a way to mitigate COVID transmission. And we present a control message, a message that speaks to more liberal moral values, and a message that speaks to more conservative moral values, and measure perceived persuasiveness, intentions, and attitudes. So here are the kinds of messages that we use. Control message, just like very plainly like, hey, wear a mask, period. That's the end of my message. The liberal version, drawing on themes of harm and fairness. And then the conservative version, drawing on themes of loyalty and purity, right? So this is sort of adapted from what's been shown to work in previous work on moral foundations framing. So here's what we find. We find this three-way interaction when we look at perceived persuasiveness, and this pattern also emerges when we look at people's intentions to wear a mask and their support for a mask mandate. And so three-way interactions are such a bear. I always forget how much I don't want to talk about it until this slide comes up. But let's start with the control condition. So this is, I think, a really important condition, because this is a message that does not draw upon moral appeals at all. And so it's actually very nice, theoretically, that there's no interaction here, right? That all we see is an overall effective ideology where conservatives in general are finding this pro-mask message less convincing than liberals, right? It doesn't matter whether they moralize their politics, because this message doesn't talk about morality. It's irrelevant to that dimension. If we jump to the harm fairness message on the left, here we get this interaction where the people who most moralize their political views are showing the strongest ideology effect in response to this message, right? So appealing to liberal values, which maybe are the values that are predominantly incorporated in mask rhetoric, in the last year, is showing this effect. And you're seeing that liberals are rating it more persuasive than conservatives if they moralize than if they don't, right? Whereas conservatives are rejecting it more if they moralize than if they don't, right? And we're getting a slight flip here when we appeal to more conservative values, where I think the nice thing here is that the folks who moralize their politics the least are showing kind of your standard ideology effect, where conservatives are rejecting a mask appeal and liberals are relatively more positive toward it. But we undermine that political divide when we speak to conservative values. So sure, we kind of are alienating moralized liberals with this message, but we're appealing somewhat more to moralizing conservatives compared to non-moralizing conservatives. So, we could spend 3 hours taking off our glasses and peeking at this graph as much as we want. To me, that's kind of a general takeaway, and maybe I'll be interested if there are further insights that you glean from this. But overall, this program of work tends to sort of emphasize in some ways the message that we get from research on moralization, moral conviction, moral mandates, which is that attaching morality to your attitude should predict stronger attitudes. And indeed, it does in lots of domains, but it can also predict susceptibility to persuasion when those messages are appealing to morality, right? And especially when you use the right kinds of moral arguments. So I think it's a neat way to think about moralization in a way that's slightly different from the kind of like it signals rigidity always and forever. Instead, I sort of see this as just it signals the dimension of interest when we talk about that issue, right? In the same way that when I think my attitude toward pizza is built on my affective reactions, you could tell me all day that it's unhealthy and expensive, and I'd go, well, it makes me feel good. And so we're at an impasse here. In the same way, when people moralize, sure, they'll resist messages if they are irrelevant to the core concerns that person has when they think about this issue. So I think that's sort of the meta takeaway from the moral matching work thus far. Okay, so final thank you to all the folks who contributed to this work. Would love to hear from you in the coming days, weeks, years, if you have thoughts on this work. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was such an interesting talk. Lots to think about. And we've got lots of questions in the Q&A. So clearly it was interesting and a lot of people want to hear some more. So Malcolm, we'll sort of take one by one. We'll just take it in turns to go through. So first question is from Jessa Stegall. This is fascinating work, and Andy, if you want, you can navigate to the Q&A tab as well if you want to, read them on the screen as well, if that helps. So Jessa's asking, when it comes to moral matching, do you get the sense that people are doing a sort of moral cost-benefit analysis? For example, if you had a moral message against someone's stance on recycling, plus a suggestion for something more effective, would the change in attitude be stronger? and she's curious if people are being more utilitarian or deontological in their moral attitudes.
So I'll start with the last one, just because this often comes up, this deontological versus utilitarian. In some ways, my sense is that the literature on moralization hasn't really grappled with this distinction. And if anything, I kind of think that the patterns that we see in the research that I shared suggest that oftentimes when people say that their attitude is based on moral concerns, they're communicating a more deontological morality, where it's just kind of like, yep, I just think that it's about what's right and what's wrong. And because the control groups in these messages are often like utilitarian arguments, right? Instrumental arguments. And we're finding that those who moralize their attitudes are generally resistant to that kind of rhetoric. And so my feeling is that what we know less about in this literature is what are people thinking when they say, I've built this attitude on my moral beliefs and convictions. We kind of just let that mean whatever people want it to mean. And I think that's an interesting question unto itself, which is just like, what are people's lay theories about what morality means? And so if we went out and found a pocket of people who are like hardened moral utilitarians, we may find the flip of our findings, where when they say this is about morality, what they mean is I'm looking at what is the, going to have the most impact on these sort of utilitarian concerns. So my real answer is I don't have a great answer, but my okay answer is that kind of response. And then it's the other part about how I think it's kind of like, how can we make these messages even more compelling by like not only just, I think it's sort of like, not only countering someone's position, but adding new reasons. In some ways, a message can do both at the same time. And I think ours kind of do, which is not, it's sort of like, well, maybe not. Actually, most of the time we are saying like, this is not good. And it's not good because it does morally bad things. But you could plausibly also include in that message, like, and in addition, by doing this alternative thing, moral good stuff would happen. Maybe it would strengthen it, and maybe it would, the question is, we're only measuring attitudes toward the thing that we're challenging and not towards some alternative. But if that's your practical goal, then presumably you need to also argue the alternative, in the same way that fear appeals and persuasion aren't great unless you tell people like, here's what you should do instead, right? Don't just be afraid of what smoking will do to you. Here's the number to call to figure out how to quit smoking, etc.
Awesome. Our next question is from Tobia. Hi, Andy. Thank you for the talk. Do you think a moral shotgun of messages based on multiple moral values, foundations, even mixing values and foundations that are supported and opposed by respondents would still persuade people because they're still moral? Or does this technique require moral congruency?
You're reading my mind. This is sort of where some of this is going. In some ways, so one way we've tried to do something a little like that, so it's outside of moral foundations, but it's with the COVID social distancing study, is we thought like, okay, what if we just say both, this is good for your health and also it's going to help other people? Shouldn't that just be like the best for everyone? And we actually kind of, surprising to me a little bit, found it was working exactly the same as just saying this is good for everyone, right? So I sort of thought that we'd get buy-in across the board by appealing to multiple dimensions of the issue, but we didn't. Your question is a little different though, which is using different values. And in some ways, as I mentioned, the messages we use often do that. So we deliberately were like, it's not the best approach, but I'll validate our messages with the Moral Foundations Dictionary with a text analysis of our own materials, just to show that like we're using language that is evocative of all five of the sort of, five go-to foundations. But I think you're right that there's a concern, as the final study kind of communicates, that if I appeal to the wrong moral foundation, I might actually be getting this backfire effect. It might actually be worse to do that. In some ways, I need to, again, this is the three-way interaction. There's a world where if we could compare those to the control group, it is possible. And this is sort of what I thought the trade-off was with the moral reframing work that already exists, which is like, okay, so maybe conservatives don't love harm fairness appeals, but are those at least better than a non-moral appeal, right? If they're thinking that this is a moral issue, right? You might go like, okay, I wouldn't frame it that way, but like, I see why this is communicating lots of morally relevant implications. So open question. I don't have a great answer, but I do think it's onto something that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Great, thank you. So next question is coming from Silka, who's thanking you for the very interesting talk. And they ask, which issues are considered to be moral issues should also depend on participants' ideology and possibly their cultural background? Do you have any insights on that? So I saw that this question was posted before you went to the liberal and conservative section, but I was also wondering, kind of extending on this, if you could say a little bit more about any insights you have on how liberals and conservatives come to moralize these issues differently. So it sort of started from the assumption of purity, the binding foundations and the individualizing foundations. Has your work ever, what are your thoughts on that process of moralizing those issues more than other issues? Because I feel like that's not something that's talked about too much within the moral foundations work. Perhaps it's just sort of an assumption that some people are born almost to favor purity and some not. Oh, I'm so sorry, Andy.
Okay, I'm back. I just happened to look at my other screen and it said the host has muted you, and I thought, oh my god. So interesting questions. There's a plenty of ways to take it. One, I know that some of the work that Linda Skitka has done has like posed the question, do liberals and conservatives moralize to different degrees? So there had maybe been some assumptions that like conservative ideology lends itself to moralizing issues more than liberals, and that doesn't really seem to hold water, that moralization is just something that people do. And they do it to different degrees, but not in a manner that's dependent on their politics. Whether politics are moralized more, it's an interesting question. Maybe if in different pockets of the world, politics are tied to morality to different degrees is not something I know much about. And maybe there's some evidence on that. I know that the overall correlations between ideology and those moral foundations is fairly robust cross-culturally, but we just don't have enough real data outside of the US to really probe that. So it could be that politics are just less wrapped up cleanly with those moral foundations elsewhere. But one response to that is the broader project that final study was plucked from, which is that I've been finding across all sorts of different studies and paradigms that correlation between ideology and moral foundations is moderated by how much people say they moralize politics, right? So there's individual variation in how much people say that my political views are driven by my morality, and that reflects the correlation between ideology and these values, right? And I've been wondering, like, are there things that ideology is relevant for that are still relevant even when we take the moral component away? Which suggests that like this moral reframing thing is only going to work sometimes when it's an issue that is sort of tied to the moral basis of ideology, but not so much if it's untethered from moral concerns that are wrapped up in ideology. So those are just some reflections that I would have on that question.
Thank you.
All right, the next question we have, the questions moved around, so I'll just read what's at the top of my list right now. So Stella asked a question. She also thanked you. You alluded to the idea that people who moralize their attitudes have emotional responses to things they perceive as amoral or moral. Do you think emotion or cognition plays a greater role? Oh, things are moving. Sorry. Greater role in moralizing issues? It might, of course, be also both. Just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so we were concerned about this a little bit because there is a large literature on affect versus cognition matching and persuasion. And we wanted to make sure like we're not just doing that, right? It's not just that moral attitudes are wrapped up in emotion and we're just appealing to that emotion. So we pilot tested our messages for whether they varied in perceived emotionality. And it was true that our moral messages often were perceived as more emotion driven, which is not all that surprising because there's other work, Billy Brady and others have work on Twitter data where they show that it's like not just moral tweets that go viral, it's moral emotional tweets that are especially influential. And so we thought, okay, maybe it's hard to untie those from each other. But what we did is in our studies, in addition to asking people, how much do you see your attitude on this issue as a product of your moral beliefs and convictions, we also ask, how much do you see your attitude as driven by your emotional reactions to this issue? And when we throw both into a regression, right, and we control for all the pieces of the puzzle that might be driven by just the emotion piece, the moral stuff still stands, right? So we still get a moral matching effect, even when we control for the fact that moral attitudes are often held with more emotion and our moral messages often convey more emotion. So I think the emotion helps, but I don't know that it is the mechanism.
Wonderful, thank you. And so next question from my colleague at Kent, Roger. A lot of your research, and not just yours, depends on the lay use and understanding of the word moral. And this has been questioned cross-culturally. What would you do if you were forbidden to use the word moral in your studies? In other words, what kind of constructs are definitionally underlying this lay term? And Roger's saying that some of your studies seem to address this, but others not so much.
Totally, yes. So I love this question because as someone who was started in the attitudes and persuasion tradition and moved into moral psychology, I am continually frustrated at how little we've defined what we mean when we say morality. And like, I've had that same thought about the whole literature on moral psychology. Like, what if we had to abolish the word moral? I think we'd be better served by actually like drilling into like what we mean are judgments that have these three properties. And if people use the word moral and it doesn't communicate those three properties, then it's not what we're trying to study. But I think reversing all of moral psychology is going to be a tall order at this point. If I had to stop using the word, I think you're right that, so my gripe is with moral psychologists, yours is with people in the world and what moral means to them, right? And you're right that what I like about this approach is that I don't have to define morality, right? I'm trying to understand what people do when they use that word. But in some ways that's sort of culturally constrained, right? Because that word communicates different things in different places. We've tried to do some work looking at lay theories of morality. And for example, one of the assumptions of moralizing is that it is perceived as really what it's doing is saying it's objective, right? When I frame my attitude as being about morality, what I'm saying is it's like a fact of the world. And the models of moral conviction make that premise or that assumption really deliberately. But if you actually look at the studies out there on whether people treat moral judgments as more fact-like than other kinds of judgments, such as beliefs about facts, it's not that clear that people uniformly treat morality as objective, right? And so this doesn't answer the question, but it adds to it, which is to say, we developed this measure of moral objectivity, and we find that people are all over the place in whether they say moral means objective in the same way that 2 + 2 is 4. That's not like a hard and fast part of what people mean when they say morality. And so in some ways, like I said, this is not answering your question. It's just making it a bigger, more important question, which is, yeah, we don't know. And I think I would be interested. So in this work, when I say morality, it really is about like a domain of information, right? It's kind of a type of information. Whether I can sketch out the lines of that for you, I don't know. But I kind of am suggesting that people are not saying like, I am rigid about moral stuff. It just means like there's a kind of information that can inform your position that I call moral. And when that's the kind of information I think is important, it's the information I want to hear from you if I'm going to have any chance of changing my mind, right? In the same way that I go like, I just care about facts and figures. I built my first opinion based on facts and figures. I'm going to want to hear those from you, right? It's a domain of content more so than like a subjective domain of content more than it is like a psychological process in that way. anyhow, I would love to keep talking about this, but I don't know that there's time. But those are my thoughts on that, at least in the moment.
Yes, I think unfortunately we've got so many questions this week. Everyone's so fascinated by this talk, but this is going to have to be the last question, just in the interest of time, to keep it to the hour slot. So the last question is from Joanna. Again, I'm just going by the one that's been upvoted the most. So Joanna's, again, thanking you for your talk. Do you have any work looking at whether moralization affects sensitivity to the strength of a moral argument, or does it just make people more susceptible to moral arguments across the board?
So you know what we did? This hasn't gone anywhere just because it was like the interaction order was spinning out in that project, so we had to put the kibosh for a second. But in the persuasive matching tradition, there is the question of like, why does matching work is still kind of like a curiously not great in terms of the answers that we have to it. But one of them comes from an elaboration likelihood perspective, which is that matched messages are not themselves inherently better, but they attract attention to the message, right? So in the same way that when I make my message relevant to people, they pay more attention. And from the ELM, we know that when people pay more attention to a message, they're better able to distinguish strong from weak arguments. So if people are not motivated to pay attention to the message, they can kind of fly by without even noticing this quality of the arguments inside. And so theoretically, I think it's very plausible based on that research that part of what's happening is that when I frame my message in terms of morality and you have framed your initial opinion in terms of morality, my message is not suddenly magically persuasive. You just are actually taking the time to dissect my argument. As it happens, we've tried to produce arguments in these messages that were relatively compelling. But if we were to create really weak messages, we might actually see backfire effects if we matched, because people would actually realize just how garbage our arguments were. So I do think there's some merit to that possibility, but we just don't have the evidence quite yet for it.
Great, thank you so much. And apologies to everyone that we didn't have time to, but as those who've come before, we're quite strict on the time limit, just to keep it within that slot. For those on the East Coast, it's sort of the lunchtime slot, and for those in Europe and England, it's the go make dinner time slot. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a fascinating talk, really interesting. Yeah, and all the nice words, really. It's late, I've run out of nice words. It was really cool. It was really cool.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun. And thanks for all the questions, both answered and unanswered. Not that I actually really answered many of them. I just talked in response to them.
Lots to think about. And that's sometimes the most informative and exciting bit of the Q&A. So yes, thank you, everyone. We'll be back in 3 weeks with a speaker to be confirmed in 3 weeks. So keep tuned and we'll see you in 3 weeks. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, evening, morning. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.